I'd love to introduce you to the first of our speakers, Christy Brown, an acclaimed artist working in ceramics. I remember feeling quite like Christy was a bit of a celebrity whenever I first met you, because I had known your practice and studying ceramics. I know it sounds so nerdy, but to get to know you and to meet you and to learn about your practice, particularly more so over these last number of months, has been an absolute pleasure. You've worked with BCB for a number of years. I remember seeing your work in BCB 2013 and your installation in the China Hall, and it just blew me away. And your further exhibition as part of a ward in the Petrie Museum in that year. You continued to work with BCB, and also last year it will be present in your presentation, Cultural Icons, one of the 6 exhibiting artists as part of a major exhibition, Cultural Icons, which took place in BCB in 2019. And that brings us through to BCB 2021, and Christy being selected as one of the award artists. I've been really grateful to have worked with you these past few months, and it's going to be really lovely to hear from you, Christy. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing more with us.
Thank you for that very warm welcome and introduction. It's been a real pleasure working with you and your team this year. I think what drew me to apply for awards recently is they have a very experimental approach now to award. It encourages the criteria gives you an opportunity to really stretch you as an artist. So broadly, I make clay figures, and I do live drawing, but I very, very rarely show the drawings, and I hardly ever put them together. So my aim when I made this piece called Tableau was to explore that connection between 2 and 3 dimensions. So I've created this large-scale triptych, which you can see over there, and created a row of figures that relate to the drawing to form a kind of tableau, in the hope that somehow the different mediums and the forms can have some sort of dialogue and create a kind of narrative. And I'm also picking up in this brief talk about some of the questions that I was asked on the Instagram site. So one of the first ones of those was, how has your work developed over the years? So I'll try and be brief because there's many, many years. And as I say, I'm very grateful and honoured to be included in an award, because it provides me with an opportunity to develop what is actually a 2-pronged practice. Sculpture, which is more single object, marketable object, and more thematic or site-specific or theme-driven, less commercial projects, such as this one at the Petrie Museum, quite often inspired by museum collections. And the ideas that come out of those feeds into my more separate single works, and generally expands the field of contemporary ceramic practice. So Messams, my gallery, supports me in the presentation of single works, and the Ceramics Research Centre UK at the University of Westminster often involves me in those broader dialogues. So all my clay figures largely have been inspired by museum collections. I spent a lot of time over the years looking at archaic artefacts and such as these grave goods from Korea, China, etc. And I really like the parallel between archaeology and psychoanalysis. These are sort of 2 modernist practices that grew up together, which both relate to the idea of taking away layers to reveal some sort of hidden knowledge. So there's strong metaphorical connections between those practices. So my earlier work, this was made in the 90s, this is called The Cast of Characters, and they're very much involved in the idea of the archetype. We all have some kind of archetypes in our unconscious, and the idea of dreams and muses. And that takes me on to another of the questions that I was asked is, what is mythology's relation to clay that inspires me? So in the year 2000, I made this big installation at the Wapping hydraulic power station, of a large number. It took a couple of years to make a large number of figures and smaller pieces. Sort of encouraged the idea of archaeology, sort of things hidden away in corners and so on. But it very much responded to the fact that it had been a power station which created animation, the steam power lifted Tower Bridge or raised the lifts in Claridge's back in the day. And so I made all these figures that were broadly connected to myths of origin. So we have Prometheus here on the left, who's a figure made of clay that was brought to life by the goddess Athena. Pygmalion and Galatea, an old myth from Ovid's Metamorphosis, not actually a clay, but again a kind of animation myth, about bringing to life objects, which is something that then goes on to recur in a lot of my work, the idea that objects have a life of their own. The Golem, which is, again, a clay man made of clay that you had to put the word of God into his mouth to animate him. So I made all these figures, these big figures for Wapping, and that sort of encouraged me also into this idea of directly relating to archaeology with these fragments and heads. So I think those myths of origin about human beings being made of clay, they relate through a lot of cultures, a lot of ancient cultures. And I like the idea that somehow we're all made of clay and we're standing on clay and clay is the earth. And people have made clay figures for something like 40,000 years. So I feel that that's a sort of fundamental aspect to my practice. Having said that, I'm not especially relating to the body. I'm not a body artist. As I'm much more interested in the mimetic object, that is to say, the representation that human beings make of us, ourselves. So statues or puppets or dolls or mannequins, like some of the ones you see here. So around 2004, 2004, I made this series called Between the Dog and the Wolf, which came from the French phrase entre chien et loup, which is how they describe twilight. And it is that time where the tame dog starts to turn into the unpredictable wolf. And so here we have a sort of doll-like figure, and these are about 4 foot high, so she's slowly taking on animals, characteristics, wings and beaks and tails and hooves and things. So there's a lot of ideas about metamorphosis and transition. And on the right, ex votos, that was a piece that involved a sort of archaeological find of heads, ceramic heads, filled with shards, because the ceramic shard is like the unbroken piece of history. The pot may be broken, the statue may be broken, but that little shard goes on and can tell you more about continuity in history and where people lived over the centuries. So a lot of my recent work reflects a lot of these ideas, and museum projects have fed increasingly into the work. So one of the first museums I worked with was the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology in London, which is very much a collection museum. It's a study collection. It doesn't have very many grand big things like the British Museum. Petrie was a relatively ordinary man. He wasn't an aristocrat, so he had to fundraise, and he had to go and, when he brought back things, he had to give the big things to the benefactor who'd funded him. So he was very interested in the ordinary object, and the Petrie Museum is a collection of everyday objects of ancient Egypt, which is always very interesting because it's where the boundary between when is an object everyday and when is it sacred or ritualistic, and its boundaries are very blurred in ancient history. And because it was everyday objects, so the other thing about these figures, they echo, the Egyptian figures sat like this for about 3,000 years. The old ones are very rough and ready, and the more 3,000 years ones are like quite refined and sometimes made of bronze. But nonetheless, they kept that pose, that seated pose, for 3,000 years. And that sense of continuity really appealed to me. I really, because I feel that the continuity of history is something that's really important to all of us. We need to look constantly back to the past to learn about ourselves. So I'd seated them all on everyday kitchen chairs and surrounded them with amulets. And that sort of led me, although I didn't make any human-animal hybrids, I followed on from the Petrie. I did start to think more about the human-animal hybrid and our relationship with animals and how we exploit them. And in the old days, I think, they deified them rather than, they went hunting and they deified them as a thank you. So I like this idea of the human-animal hybrid as a kind of rare creature. So I made a whole series in 2016 of hybrid creatures, exploring that theme. And that went on to be recreated again in a more recent exhibition called Beyond the Vessel, which was a big group show that went to, first of all, to Istanbul, which was remarkable, and went then to Messams just before, in their magnificent barn. If you ever get a chance to visit Messams, Wiltshire, it's worth going there just for the barn. And so I continued this theme with my European folk figures, which are largely based on European costumes recorded by various French and German photographers, Frégère and Haute, and the extraordinary costumes that's in rituals that still go on throughout Europe. So that was a bit my European plea. So yeah, as Rhiannon mentioned, Sleepover, this piece of work is part of the second major museum I worked with, which was the Freud Museum in London. So Freud collected a huge number of figurines, and he collected them all his working life. He tended to use archaeology as a sort of metaphor to explain his practice, and archaeology was a sort of much more accepted practice than psychoanalysis was, probably still is. So he used it as a metaphor, and he invested his figurines with a lot of meaning and in his own practice as he learnt how to be an analyst and analyze dreams and so on. So I made this group of work. Each one is about so high, 3 foot high, something. It's called Sleepover. They're all standing in the room in the museum that was Freud's bedroom. And I blacked it out and I positioned them in such a way that if you walked in the room, they looked like they'd all stopped what they were doing and they're staring at you in a kind of, you've interrupted us, what are you doing here? I like the idea that, when you fall asleep, your dreams take over. And so I like this idea that when you leave the room or you leave the museum, these things come to life. They have a life of their own. And of course, that is a child fantasy that most of us have had at some point, that our dolls have lives of their own. So other pieces I made for the Freud Museum, this is called My Desk, because Freud had a collection of objects that were very particular to him that he kept on his desk. So I created a similar group from a range of maquettes and fragments and bits and pieces that had slowly been amassing over many years in my studio. Then on the left, these are little Egyptian paste shabti figures of my teddy bear. They were made, in fact, really for the Petrie Museum, but I felt they were appropriate here. So that teddy bear transitional object. And on the right, the piece I Pray, again, which I made about 40 porcelain figures with wax faces that sit on various pieces of furniture in the Anna Freud's room, because Anna Freud was the sort of mother of child psychiatry. And then, as Rhiannon mentioned, I brought the group Sleepover to the Spode China Hall the following year. And I just show that slide because they positioned them in exactly the same way, but actually they looked completely, the vibe from them was completely different. Instead of being quite confrontational, they looked at me and said, "You're going to leave us here in this horrible, dark, damp place?" And I thought that was really interesting. You take a body of work that is made for a particular site and you put it somewhere else and it changes its meaning. So another museum I worked with was the John Sohn Museum. That was a group show with Claire Toomey and Nicholas Rena and Karina Ciscato. And they were quite often responding, well, Claire was responding to the idea of a legacy. Nick and Karina were very much responding to the architecture. I responded to the dysfunctional family life of the Sohn family. John Sohn came from an ordinary background, and he wanted a dynasty, and his sons were having none of it. They wanted to be in theatre and write plays and so on. And so there was a lot of dysfunction and unhappiness in the Sohn family. Sohn got this bust of himself made by Sir Francis Chantry, where he looks kind of very glorious in that kind of Greek bust classical tradition. So I decided I was going to make a bust for all of them, the whole family, and use drawings from the paintings of the family and the dog to make memorials to all of them. So there they are in the mausoleum with Fanny the dog, and she has her own bust. This one's actually, because the show toured, so that the one on the right, that was in Port Eliot, taken in Port Eliot in Cornwall. And I thought it was kind of poignant, you know, it was a way that how often a dysfunctional family, you know, a pet can be the thing that brings them back together. Oops. Sorry, just waiting for the next slide. Next slide. No, not coming. No. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay. That's, I was expecting something else, sorry. So, yeah, that broadly, just a quick reflection on how, again, how museum site-specific projects feed into your work in other ways. So these are quite, as you see, quite recent portraits, but this idea of the portrait bust continues to be something that I'm really intrigued about. It's being a bit slow. Do we have a way of moving slides on quicker, do we think? Well, sorry, the clicker's going, maybe it's losing its battery. I think we're better, yeah. Next slide. Okay, this is a museum of childhood, where, again, it was a show about dreams and the unconscious, and involved lots of children's photographs of their dreams. I made a group of work called Ludus Est, which is Latin for it is play. I chose to focus on two dolls that were upstairs in the costume department. They're very beautiful dolls made in the 30s in Italy, and they're very beautifully dressed, but I thought they looked a bit miserable. So I decided at night they would go for a walk around the museum and they would meet other toys and farm animals and dolls from overseas and birthday presents. And they'd go to school as well. They'd go and see the school, because I had a school of dolls when I was a child. Next slide, please. So there it is installed in different groups in the Museum of Childhood. And in the background there is a kind of frieze of the dolls' houses from the museum, which is kind of, one of the themes that I'm beginning to explore here in Tableau, this idea of backdrops. The next slide, please. So that's just taken me up to a date of recent work. So the doll figure kind of features now in quite a few of my pieces. These are very recent pieces from a show in London earlier this year. I was beginning to make them as a sort of, a kind of illustration of a friend of mine who's written some strange stories. But as I made them, they just started more and more to take on the feelings of the time. Next slide, please. So we have anxiety and solitude and melancholy and so on, And those feelings just kind of came out because of the difficult year that everybody's been having, difficult 18 months, came through in these works. So next slide, please. So life drawing, I've always done life drawing. The importance of life drawing to figurative artists is really where you learn a lot about form, stance, emotion. Even if you're not a figurative artist, next slide please, you look and see in a different way the more you draw. And I've been doing life drawing for like 30 years or so. I think I'm going to have to speed up. So next slide please. In early life classes, I really struggled to make two lines seem very three-dimensional. But the more you draw, the more you understand the sort of embodied form. So next slide. And then sometimes I've collaged them and put them together as sort of groups. And then just whiz through the next three, which is just because I'm fearing I'm running out of time. I've always loved drawings more than anything, more than paintings, I think, really. So these drawings, the Holbein drawings, which like really make you feel like you're in the same room as that person, even though it's 500 years ago. And the drawings of Hepworth, which are very sculptural. Kiki Smith, so now we're more in the world of imagination. And the next one, please. And Rego, of course, Paula Rego and her Magnificent, which is totally in the imagination. So understanding that connection between drawing and 3D, next slide, please. This goes right back to the 80s when I first really got going. And these are flat figures made of two flat slabs. And I was interested in that 2D, 3D, that liminal space, that gap between 2 and 3D, which is somehow where things happen. Between fantasy and reality. And I've used drawings, next slide please, a little bit in 3D work. This is a group of pieces made of different materials with bits of drawings incorporated. And next one, please. And this was a big installation called Ambika's Dream, where this child, Ambika, loved the zoo. She was it's a long story, but I won't go on to it. But it is a sick child that loved the London Zoo, and her father gave a lot of money to the gallery. So next slide, please. So then, these are the three drawings that I broadly chose to bring here and enlarge them. And next one, please. Those are sort of A1 size. So these are then what became the drawings in the piece you see, the tableau. So it's quite difficult to go from A1 to sort of 3 meters across, particularly when you have huge amounts of room. I wanted a triptych because I think a triptych is sort of historically imparts narrative. It creates some kind of sequence. And it shows the different elements of the same subject matter, like a theatre or an altar. So very briefly, next one. 2 years ago, as Rhiannon said, Tessa Peters and I did a show in the Petrie Museum here. And it was a response to the Staffordshire figurines. And 6 artists, next one please, I made television characters. So this is Love Island and Strictly Come Dancing and Friends, and you can see what I watched on television. And we also made, next one please, all the 6 artists involved in that show made simple molds that could then be reproduced, mass-produced, and it was run all through the summer with the local community, clay communities here in Stoke-on-Trent. And next one, please, and shown within the show at the Petrie Museum. It was a wonderful show. So I went back to this practice to understand how to make my work for these. For tableau. Next one, please. So this is just a bit quick technical. I decided to make big flat backs, really. So, I just modelled a half figure and then I cast it. Next one, please. Next slide, please. And turned it over, raised it, cast it again, and then you end up with a very big, heavy 2-piece press mould. So that's really how they're all made. And next slide, please. A third question that was asked on the Instagram site was, what clays do I use? Well, I use a white stoneware, which is sometimes glazed, sometimes slip painted, or I use this terracotta, Wengeling terracotta, which is a very rich red, more red. It comes from Holland, I think. So, running out of time. Next slide, please. Lots of experiments with, heights and cardboard cutouts and drawings evolving alongside, trying to work out, the measurements and the next slide. Then, trying to get some distance in the studio, and they're photographing them and doing little paper cutouts. So there's a lot of that goes on when you're trying to do an installation, and it's quite a big risk, really, because you don't know until you set it up. You don't really know what you've got. And so I don't know, there's lots of questions that I could take it further and how I'm going to take it further, which I'm not quite sure. Next slide, please. So that's the final thing. And I'd just like to end on the quote. Last slide, please, Rhiannon. There's no dead matter. Its inertia is merely an outward show behind which untold forms of life lie hidden. And my vision is always better, I think, than the finished product. But thank you very much for listening.